The photograph you're looking at right now is by one of the most famous post-war American artists, but he's known mostly for his paintings and his sculptures and not for his photography. This is the late Robert Rauschenberg that just died in the past year. This is a small original photograph of an unmade bed. I think it's a very beautiful piece that very much relates to his Combine paintings that hung on the wall, where he would paint a bed, and he would paint the sheets back in the late 50s, early 60s. And this is an original little photograph that he actually put the invitation to an opening at Leo Castelli, the famous gallery, Leo Castelli Gallery, in 1969. And he printed the invitation on the back of an original photograph. And so everybody that got the invitation to the opening got an original Robert Rauschenberg. So it's 40 years old, and it's a fabulous little jewel of a work of art by Rauschenberg. This is a photograph that the Benvenistes decided to put on the invitation for the opening, and it's both wonderful in the nature of what photography is about. Photography is different than painting. Pablo Picasso, Lucien Freud will paint a picture for 1 week, 2 weeks, 1 month, 2 months, and the painting will be a success or not a success. But the photographer has the chance, as you can see in this proof sheet that has 12 different images on it, the photographer has the chance of taking multiple photographs and then later deciding which one is a good one. And so even amongst a famous and professional photographer such as Jacques Lowe, who was the official photographer for the Kennedy family here, he had the options of picking the right photograph. Now, as you can see, it's been marked with the orange grease pencil, so he's obviously liked something very much about these up in the upper right-hand corner. But as I look at it, I find, in my personal taste, I like the one where there's this communication between the young Caroline Kennedy and Jackie down below, but he obviously went for another one. There's something rather poignant about this photograph. There's something poignant about photography, in the sense that I think when you look at a painting, when you look at a Goya painting, when you look at a Picasso painting, you don't look at the whatever's depicted in the Goya painting or the Picasso and say, oh my God, those people are dead. There's a sense of a certain kind of timelessness that occurs in painting and sculpture. But when you look at photography, especially in the case here, where only 5 years later from this photograph, the president, this man who was not yet president when these photographs were taken, went to the highest of highs in being elected president, and then after less than 3 years was assassinated and died. All of that is to come. In this photograph, the presidency hasn't occurred yet, his death hasn't occurred yet. All those things are coming in. So photography locks a moment in time. And Roland Barthes, the great Roland Barthes, the French philosopher, who wrote probably the most interesting book on the nature of photography, called Camera Lucida, he once said that every photograph, whether they meant it to or not, is a catastrophe, because it locks something in time that can never come back again. And then on top of all of that, the poignancy. In this particular photograph, we have a situation where Jacques Lowe, whose archives were in, this was at once part of, I acquired it later. He thought, I've got my big photographic archives, I've got to store them someplace very safe. And so where did he store them? He stored them in the World Trade Center. And when the World Trade Center collapsed in the attack of 9/11, all of his negatives, all of the proof sheets that were stored, they were all destroyed and lost. And so this photograph is actually is what was not meant to be rare, but it is now very rare because his archive was lost. The photograph above here that we're talking about is the nature of unintentional absurdity, almost unintentional dada, in that what we have here is a photograph of a contingent of sailors in World War II, probably about 1942 or 43. And somebody's taken this photograph, this big group photograph, and somehow thought, oh my God, what if this gets in the hands of the Nazis or the Japanese? And somebody has gone and carefully censored and put a line very, very carefully through every single sailor's face so that you cannot recognize them. And so when it was done in some sort of crazy piece of bureaucracy of World War II. But in retrospect, it comes off looking nothing so much as like a John Baldessari, the avant-garde American artist. It looks like it's an altered work by some avant-garde artist of today, even though it did not have that intent at the time. So sometimes photographs have this marvelous way of having a life at one point and then become something else in the future. I want to talk about these up here. One of the things that I find about photography is, as much as I like Diane Arbus and Nan Goldin and some of the famous photographers, I try to have as broad a sense of curiosity as possible. And one area I find has got some amazing photographs to discover is in the area of cinematic photography. And there are two photographs in this exhibition that were set photographs taken during the filming of the great Orson Welles' second movie called The Magnificent Ambersons. And they're both up here. And Orson Welles' use of camera angle, low viewpoint, are extraordinary, and they create almost expressionistic images with their radical viewpoints, as you can see here in these photographs. And I was rather amused because we hung the show over the weekend, and on Sunday I was at the Prado, and in the bookstore of the Prado was a copy of a book on the films of Orson Welles, a great big expensive coffee table book. And there in the book, with big full-page spreads, were the two photographs that we have in this exhibition across the street, you know. And not a lot more than the book. So then, you know, the nature, one of the things that I'm really proud of this particular show is that people have this crazy idea that art is expensive, collecting is beyond people's means and things like that. And it really isn't. Somebody said, well, how can you part with these things? And well, of course, I have a large collection, but I also have a couple of children. And my children said, Dad, you have too much stuff. You've just got too much stuff. But in the case of a photograph like this, for instance, which is a great favorite of mine, this very, very mysterious photographs of North Africa by a famous French photographer named Bonfils from the 1870s, where the woman's face has been covered up by this cloth to the point that it almost looks like there's nobody there. It looks like there's a post or something. And the only reason this is in the show is that I actually discovered two copies of it. And so I have one at home, and I can allow one to go. But this is a photograph that I don't think I would let go, except I discovered a second one, and it's a beautiful thing. The only photograph in the exhibition that is printed later, some people get confused about photography because it's a multiple medium, and so they look at these photographs and they say, oh, there must be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these. And the funny thing is, in many of these photographs, if a photograph was a small amount of money and somebody said, I'll give you 50 times as much, if you could just find me another vintage print of that, I'd say keep your money because I'm never going to find another one. These things don't turn up. They're not like buying a Sony Walkman in a store. Some of them, although they were printed from a negative, the negative was never printed very many times at the time because until very recently people did not consider photography something to collect. And so some of these photographs are quite rare. Everything in the exhibition is so-called vintage. In other words, the print was made at the time that the photograph was taken. There's only one that was printed later, and that was this one here, which is this photograph of a nude, probably from the 1920s in France. And the reason I got it, even though it was printed later, it was probably printed in the 1980s, is that this wonderful print of this woman by lamplight, by fireplace light, is on this broken piece of negative. And I just thought that it was such an interesting piece that I would get it in, because I think it's just so extraordinarily interesting.